Hi everyone, my name is Sharon Curtis. You might know me from doing Civic shows, but I've also been working doing Himi shows since the beginning of the year. And my background is probably more die cutting card making, but in the last 6 months or so I've really enjoyed getting into some more sort of artistic things like using the gouache paints, the watercolour paints, and today we're going to have a look through some of the sort of basic techniques that you might need if you're getting into just first starting with watercolours and gouache. So let's start with the basics. What is gouache? What are watercolours? They're kind of similar in that they're both water-based. They're both, in my opinion, really easy to use, and I think a lot of us are kind of intimidated by the word gouache because we don't know what it is. And I have to admit, before I started doing the Himi shows, the only time I'd use gouache actually was just for doing white splatters on my work. I had one tube and that was it. I always felt gouache was something for proper artists, not a card maker like myself. But actually, I don't know why I was so intimidated, because it's probably the easiest thing to use, probably even easier than watercolours. So let's talk about the differences. Watercolours are a translucent medium. So you're going to be using them with water to paint with, and you will see through the colours. So if you put a light colour down, if you go over it with a dark colour, you'll kind of still see some of the undertones, even if it's a lighter colour. With gouache, on the other hand, it can be opaque. Gouache is the best way to describe gouache is in between watercolours and acrylic paints. Now acrylic paints are also water-based, but an acrylic paint is opaque, and once it's down, it's down. You can't kind of come back and play with it, reactivate it. Whereas a gouache, you can. So in my opinion, a gouache is a good all-rounder actually, because if you use a lot of water with it, it has the same properties as watercolour, and you can use it in the same way. And you can actually mix and match it with watercolours as well. But if you're using it quite thickly, then you can get the opaque layers that give you those sort of real abstract looks to your paintings. And in that way it's quite easy, because you can come in and add your highlights at the end, for example, whereas with watercolour you'd need to leave your white space white to keep it clear, sort of thing. So let's talk about what you're going to need for both watercolouring and gouache. It's the same tools for both because they're both water-based. So the first thing you're going to need is some good cardstock. For watercolours, it's very important that you use watercolour cardstock, because you're going to be using a fair amount of water with a watercolour. With gouache, I find you can get away with slightly different mediums. For example, I quite often use this paper pad with my gouache. Because gouache can be opaque, you can use it on darker cardstock. So actually I use this pad a lot, which isn't watercolour card at all, it's actually a photo album. So I would say with gouache, experiment, because you can get away with lots of different types of cardstock. With watercolour, stick to watercolour cardstock. The next thing you're going to need is some paintbrushes. Now Himi do a fabulous selection. Let me bring those in. I've got a huge selection here of Himi brushes. I do like the Himi brushes actually. You've got a beautiful selection of sizes. I keep mine in 2 separate pots. I keep all my round brushes in one. So you can see I've got a really good selection of sizes here, up to a really nice big one. And then flat brushes. With the Himi brushes, you get 2 different types of flat brushes. You get, let's find, so you've got a sort of squared off flat brush. This is going to be used with both watercolours and gouache for sort of doing your background washes. And then this one with the sort of rounded edges is called a filbert brush. It can be used in the same way as a wash brush to just lay colour down sort of on your background. But this is also great for quite a lot of techniques, because used sideways like that you can get quite good detail with it. It's quite good if you're like me, you like painting florals and things like that. It's good for doing leaves and that kind of thing. Oh, I've got a round one sneaked into that pot. So get yourself, if you're starting out, I would get yourself one of each. Get one filbert, one sort of square flat brush, and then a good size pointed brush. Ideally get a couple of these, but if you're just sort of starting out and you just want a starter, go for a sort of mid-size, like say maybe something like that, which is a number 4. So something like that would be a good starter set. And then I would add to it. It kind of depends what your favourite things to colour are going to be, really, as to what you end up with in sort of total. So that's your brushes. I do, in addition to that, use quite a big flat brush if I'm doing a whole sort of sky background, particularly on a watercolour. Then I like to go in with a bigger brush so I can get a lot of colour down quickly. So that's brushes. The next thing you're going to need is some palettes. Now, a lot of the Himi sets come with a plastic palette included in the kit, which is great. The travel watercolour set, which I've got here, has its own palette, and actually it's quite nifty. It's got a palette either side, so for a travel set that's really cool because you've actually got quite a lot of mixing areas. I tend to use ceramic palettes when I'm at home. I've got this one with the little segments, and then I also use this large one. If you don't want to invest in one of these straight away, a plate will do. You just need a slick surface. A plate, a bit of, even a bit of acrylic would do. And then water. While you're working, it's a good idea to have two on the go. So I've got a nice proper paint pot here, and then I've just got a plastic container. I keep one with clear water in, and then one for sort of rinsing off my dirty paintbrush. So that's your basic equipment, and then of course we need the paints. So today I've brought with me my large 112 set of Himi gouache. So we're going to have a look at those. And then I've brought a couple of the watercolour sets with me. I've just shown you I've got the little travel one, which is really handy. Don't be fooled by the fact that this is a small set, because it's very easy to mix colours, and I am going to go into that in a little bit of detail further on. So don't feel you need to have a massive set. However, it is quite handy to have all the colours. I'm a bit lazy when it comes to mixing colours, I must admit. So I've also brought with me a couple of my Himi sets. This one was one called Himi Friends. This one's got some quite cool neons and pearlescent, as well as the plain watercolours. And then I've got a more, what I would call a more basic set, which is this one here, solid watercolours. So that's what we're going to be using today, but obviously use what you've got. And of course check out the Himi shows. We have Himi shows on Hobby Maker every month, and we usually bring in new sets as soon as Himi release them, so you definitely don't want to miss those shows. And then there was one other thing I thought about. Oh yes, a spray bottle. This is quite useful for some techniques, even just mixing your paints on your palette. Sometimes if you want a little bit more water, sometimes it's quite easy to just spritz a bit of water on, so having a water bottle is quite handy too. I'm going to mention one other piece of sort of equipment that we sell here on Hobby Maker. If you're going for the gouache paints, the spray that Hobby Maker sell is really useful. It's an anti-mildew spray. If you're storing your gouache paints maybe in a damp, conservatory or somewhere where the air's a little bit more humid, it's a good idea to just give them a little spray before you put them away. This stops any mildew forming on your paints, so it's a useful thing to have as well. You'll also want to give them a spritz when you open them up to sort of get the paint activated before you start. So I think that's all the basic materials we're going to need. Let's start painting. In the next video we're going to be looking at all the basic techniques that you're going to need for both watercolours and gouache, so make sure you tune in for that, and also of course don't forget to like and subscribe.